you. I'm very, very pleased to welcome Dr. Peter Rosenberg. He's a senior scholar of linguistics at the European University of Viadrina in Frankfurt Oder in Germany, but he lives in Berlin. Dr. Rosenberg's research takes a sociolinguistic approach. He focuses on dialectology and comparative language island, or sometimes referred to as speech islands in German Sprachinseln research. He also works on German in an international context, as well as language and ethnic identity. His most recent publications have covered topics such as language islands worldwide, theoretical and methodological issues, which was an article that appeared in the Journal of Language Contact just this year, the history of Mennonite Low German in the Altai, sounds like a familiar topic, which appeared last year, and German in Latin America, which also appeared last year. And the topic of his presentation today is a brief sociolinguistic history of Plautdietsch in the Altai, Russian. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Rosenberg.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Well, I'm going to sit down because I've written it down to be brief in 45 minutes. Makes it necessary to write it down. Okay, so nice to be back in Madison. It was in 2006 that we were here with a student group and took part in a conference on the German language and immigration in international perspective, organized by Mark Loudon and Joe Selmans. Some things have changed apparently in the meantime. The hair seemed fuller, or at least there was still some. But it was a beautiful Indian summer like now. It is hard to imagine that in this atmosphere, I'm now talking about a region, the Black Sea region, where the Mennonites began their wanderings through Russia, which we all know from the news of our days, because there's war in Europe today. But let's start a little bit more gently. The Plautdietsch-speaking linguistic community of the Mennonites in Siberia, Russia, belong to those German language islands which have maintained German varieties most. They were literally language islands. It's maybe disputable if they were German language islands, but that is a topic we could tackle in the discussion. Until the exodus of the 1990s, their East Low German linguistic varieties were a boundary marker. It is that they were seen as a representation of an ethnocultural distinctivity, which is rooted in an Anabaptist religious belief system. Plautdietsch is one of the best described German varieties in Russia, former USSR, which is due to the maintenance of a distinct linguistic community in spite of all its migrations, whether they have been voluntary or forced. Linguists and other researchers interested in language have studied Mennonite Low German in Russia, or former USSR, since 100 years. And as one of the first subjects, research was immediately revived when political liberalizations permitted this risky task. Migrations have brought Mennonites to the Americas, which Götz will talk about. The last migration brought them also to Germany in large numbers, again seeking regions of Mennonite agglomeration in East Westphalia, Northwest Germany, which we will hear from Claudia. In this talk, I will describe the sociolinguistic history of the Mennonite Altai language islands in more detail, tracing their periods of development up to the present state. Please note the didactically colors, sophisticated colors. When we got through the red zone to the violet zone, everybody knows everything will come to an end, and that's good, okay? It draws on a multitude, my paper draws on a multitude of Russian, German, North American, and other linguistic, historical, ethnological, and geographical sources, including Mennonite writing from 170 years, sources that are scattered, difficult to access, and in some cases hardly related to each other. For reasons of time, the detailed description of the linguistic structure of Plautdietsch, which is to be dealt with elsewhere, had to be omitted. But, of course, the sociolinguistic periodization refers to linguistic phenomena. And if anyone is interested in a more complete version of the paper, it can be obtained as an off-print. The sociolinguistic history of Altai Mennonite Low German Plautdietsch, the prehistory. The Mennonites are an Anabaptist movement named after Menno Simons, 1496 to 1561, a reformer born in Wittmarsum, Friesland, who took the word of God as the only inspiration of human behavior, thus placing scripture higher than any works of man. 16th century baptism had originated in Switzerland and South German regions after persecutions in the two main regions of Anabaptism in Flanders and later in West Friesland and Switzerland, of course. Baptists gathered in East Friesland. Due to the persecutions, Mennonites had to flee from the Netherlands, the first ones before 1550, Black Circle, and settled in the area in and around Danzig, Gdansk in West Prussia, Red Circle, which was at that time under the Polish crown. After the first documented Mennonite settlement, 1569, at the mouth of the river Vistula, Weichsel, Red Triangle, they founded several villages until the turn of the 17th century with 5,000 settlers who were well accepted as farmers and dikers. In the course of time, they adopted the East Low German varieties of their neighborhood, but retained the Dutch language as sacrolanguage. In the second half of the 18th century, Standard German was more and more replacing Dutch as the language of service. The period of development in the Black Sea region. When this region came under the German-Prussian crown as a consequence of the Polish partitions since 1772, Prussia demanded military service from all inhabitants and restricted purchase of land. In 1780, 13,000 Mennonites lived in this area when the Russian Empress Catherine II invited particularly German-speaking settlers from abroad. This was part of a big German migration to Russia since 1763. The Mennonite migration is marked with light red arrows between the two red squares. Territories in the Black Sea region, New Russia called, captured in the Russian-Turkish wars, should be colonized, reclaimed, and fortified, red square again. Since 1789, the first settlers founded the Chortica colony, the Blue Circle, which is today a suburb of Zaporizhia. Since 1804, they founded the Molochna colony, the Red Circle. The Molochna colony, called the New Colony, was bigger than the Chortica colony, called the Old Colony, closer to the Black Sea, more prosperous and somehow more prestigious. The settlers spoke East Low German varieties, two different varieties already brought along from West Prussia. According to Quiring, 1928, Chortica settlers came predominantly from the Vistula Spit Coast, again the Blue Circle, Molochna settlers from the Great Werder district, the delta region between Nogat and Vistula, Red Circle. The Chortica and the Molochna variety. They were of noticeable distinctness. Researchers agree to a differing extent to the common East Low German characteristics of Plautdietsch. On the one hand, Flemish characteristics in the Chortica variety are noticeable, especially the, quote, strong tendency of palatalization, unquote, in vocalism, a quotation by Siemens, Chortica Ü instead of Molochna U in, for example, Hüs, Müs, Früh, Üd, against or versus whose, moose, fru, ut, which is house, mouse, woman, and out of. Or the Flemish and Chortitzer verbal ending, first and third person plural, n instead of the apocope of n in Frisian and the Molochner variety. Siemens mentions, on the other hand, several features in Low Prussian which could be connected to the Frisian language, like, for instance, the diphthongization of a to au in Frisian laum, lamp, the delabialization of the umlaut in Frisian dreim, a dream, the clitic personal pronouns in Frisian sechter, he says, or the pronunciation of sibilants like Frisian sh versus or instead of Low German s. It is not certain, however, that the possible Frisian influence in Low Prussian came with the Mennonites to the Danzig area, since Dutchmen and also West and East Frisians had always contributed to the West Germanic colonization of the territories east of the River Elbe. Postma, 1959, puts the Frisian share at less than 20%. A feature widely discussed as of Frisian origin is the palatalization of k, g, and g before and after palatal vowels and after L and R. To Plautdietsch, j, and j, like in Georgia, which would be in Low German Karg or Kerke, English church, and you detect the similarity, Georgia church, it is palatalization of k, of course. Gripe, Low German griepen or griepen, grip, grasp in English. Bridge, Low German brug or brug, bridge in English. These features are similar while not identical to Frisian ch, y, and j. The extent and the origin of differences between the Chortitzer and the Molochner variety, however, were controversial. They have been explained by researchers in various ways, each of which has its own arguments and weaknesses. Jemunski and others consider the differences to be due to Frisian substrate, Molochner, in contrast to Flemish characteristics, Chortitzer, while the Frisian influence remains uncertain. Mitzka, 1943, traces these differences back to changes in Low Prussian within the mere 15 years interval until Molochner settlers left West Prussia. Jedig and others assume internal development since, for instance, palatalization of k exists in many languages like local Polish and Baltic varieties, Swedish, English, and others. Teugstoff suggests social differences to be more important. Chortitzer settlers were poorer than Molochner settlers, which had linguistic consequences. In the first Chortitzer years, few people could speak standard German and no preacher was available. Siemens relates the varieties to the regions of origin in West Prussia. Quote, Chortitzer Plautdietsch is the recent spit variety, Nährungsblatt, and Molochner Plautdietsch, the recent Werder variety, the Great Werder, Werderplatt, unquote. Indeed, the isoglossis between these varieties can still be found in Mitzka's map from 1924. Wiesinger, like Mitzka and Siemens, argues for yet another source. He accounts for the effect of language contact, Sprachbund, because similar phenomena could be observed in Slavic and Baltic varieties at that time in the West and East Prussian region. Siemens adds the effect of imposition, at least in Chortitzer Flemish phonology. East Low German had been adopted on the articulatory base of Flemish, which may hold for the Chortitzer vocalism. Considering the different sources of influence, tracing back the Chortitzer and Molochner varieties linearly to the Flemish and Frisian regions of origins seems doubtful. The alternative rows, Flanders, Vistula, Spit, Chortitzer versus Friesland, Great Werder, Molochner, turn out to be too simple. As a matter of fact, features of the Chortitzer and the Molochna varieties are still distinguishable. However, dialect mixing and dialect leveling occurred since a long time. However, contact between Mennonites of different origin was growing already in the Black Sea region, since Mennonites were economically prosperous, assiduous, and mobile. Leibbrandt's map of Mennonite colonies in the Black Sea region includes 21 Mennonite daughter colonies in the vicinity. Among them, 11 founded by Chortitzer settlers, blue circles, 6 by Molochna settlers, red, and 4 by both, blue and red. In mixed colonies, the varieties were in immediate contact. Conservative in religious terms, but progressive in economic terms, Mennonites founded modern trading companies, factories, and mills, which were mainly run by Molochna entrepreneurs. As a direction of change, the Molochna variants were perceived as more prestigious and distinguished, Queering 1928, and became more attractive to young people. Since the 1860s, the great reforms initiated economic and administrational modernization, unification, and increasing social mobility in Russia. They included a reluctant abandonment of serfdom, some efforts in establishing a countrywide administration, and a common school system. The common school system implemented Russian as the language of education. While other German-speaking groups, for instance, the Volga Germans, were afraid of facing a language shift to Russian, the educational language policy in the Mennonite institutions was not severely affected. As the Mennonite language community had a stable system of linguistic variation, Russian was accepted as a gain in linguistic competence and included in the curriculum. However, with the intensified nation-building efforts of the Russian government since the 1860s, and with upcoming Russian nationalism in the 1870s, about 18,000 Mennonites emigrated to North America, mainly to Canada, when for the first time the immigrants' privileges were abolished. The remaining Mennonites took advantage of the new opportunities for mobility and founded daughter colonies at first in the vicinity after the turn of the 20th century, when the Stolypin reforms implemented new land colonization projects in Central Asia and Siberia. They set out for more remote territories. The 1897 Russian census had counted 66,000 Mennonites. Migrations to West and Central Siberia set in the years 1899 to 1910, with 4 areas of settlement in the Slavgorod, Pavlodar, Omsk, and Minusinsk districts. In Siberia, these settlements were only initially separated by their varieties, but merged since the time of persecution and the collectivization of kolkhoz agriculture. Chortitzer and Molochna settlers lived side by side. As Hugo Jehlich, the well-known dialectologist for the Russian-German varieties, noted with regard to the Altai colonies, quote, language leveling has also largely occurred in the Low German settlements of the Altai region in favor of the Molochna dialect, but it has not yet been fully completed to this day, unquote. The period since the persecution and deportation in Western Siberia, with stronger inter- and intra-linguistic convergence. For the period of persecution in the late 1920s and the 1930s, Vogt mentions a loss of 40,000 victims of, at this time, 120,000 Mennonites. With increasing restrictions in the late 1920s, a second wave of emigration emerged, with again about 20,000 emigrants. Mennonites have been persecuted due to their faith, as well as being more prosperous and educated than other Soviet citizens, which is why they have been suspected of being kulaks, that is, rich farmers. Persecutions also affected the research and the researchers on Mennonite varieties and other German ones. The years of publications of major contributions reflect fairly well the alternating waves of bans and freedom granted for research. Free or at least accepted research in Russia is marked in this table by a red line, restricted by a dotted or broken line. And please note the fate of the Russian researchers in red during the Stalin era, which ranged from a ban on research to punishment in Siberian exile and death. At the end of the 1920s, the collectivization was enforced. By 1935, all Mennonite churches were closed, all preachers were arrested and or killed. The Altai German Rayon was finally abolished in 1938, like other autonomous rayons and district or valley Soviets at this at this time in the USSR. This was the end of the self-reliant Mennonite community in Russia, USSR. Discontinuity became the most significant characteristic of these communities, like all other Germans. In 1941, German troops occupied the West Ukraine, including the most part of the Chortitsa and Molochna territories. Only the settlements in the south of Molochna could be deported by the Russians. Under the German occupation, the Mennonite institutions were re-established. Mennonites were also drafted into the Wehrmacht and into the Waffen-SS, and there was also collaboration among Mennonites. The Mennonite lexicon states that, quotation, Russian-German Mennonites not only suffered under Soviet power, but also occasionally took part in the extermination of the Jewish population in their area during the occupation by the German Wehrmacht, unquote. Einsatzkommando 6, again a quotation, recruited around 20 young Mennonite volunteers from the villages of Chortitsa as auxiliaries for the security service who, together with other Ukrainian and Russian volunteers, organized the so-called Zaporozhye massacre in a gravel pit south of the former Mennonite village of Schönwiese in October 1941. This is the first time that Mennonites were directly involved as perpetrators in the Holocaust, unquote. A black chapter in the history of Mennonite peacefulness. Of course, there was collaboration because people knew what to expect from Stalin after the victory of the Red Army. But despite collaboration, there were no saboteurs and spies, quotation, among them, as Stalin's deportation decree had claimed, and even the SS judged their political awareness to be underdeveloped. Since Germans treated the so-called Bolshevized Germans like conquerors,
alienation emerged. Nevertheless, 35,000 Mennonites were trekking with the retreating German troops from the Black Sea territory to Germany or occupied Polish territory. 23,000 of them have been forcibly repatriated to the USSR, the remaining 12,000 moving on to Canada, Latin America, or hiding and staying in Germany. When the so-called Soviet Germans were partially rehabilitated in 1955, those who lived in the climatically unpleasant north migrated to the south, that is to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Western Siberia near Omsk and Barnaul. This, in turn, increased the discontinuity of settlement, the heterogeneity of the population, and hence dialect contact, as no standard German was taught for over 20 years. The period of liberalization, language shift, and language change. With the exculpation decree of 1964, which followed the de-Stalinization under Khrushchev, there was some liberalization after the Mennonites joined the Soviet Baptist Organization as a German section. German-speaking preachers were often not admitted, however. In the Altai, the daughter colonies from the turn of the centuries, the settlements of deportees migrated from the north, and the settlements of the forced laborers of the Trudarmia came together. In the Slavgorod region, the proportion of German-speaking inhabitants increased. 2/3 of these villages were Low German-speaking Mennonite villages. The other ones were what they called Lutheran, mostly vulgar German varieties, or Catholic-speaking ones, and only a few mixed ones. With a whole generation of illiterate people who had not been able to attend school in the Gulag or in the labor army, there were only older people who spoke standard German. But imagine some of them actively spoke 2 or 3 dialects, as we observed at the beginning of our research in 1990. In 1990, just before the breakdown of the Soviet Union, the district comprised 12 villages with almost 18,000 inhabitants as the census of 2010 contained. What had happened in the 50 villages of the 60s on the map just seen? The establishment of central villages around the agricultural kolkhoz centers since the 1970s reduced the number of villages and brought their inhabitants together regardless of their linguistic or religious composition. Until the 1980s, most of these villages became heterogeneous central villages, 1 village, red circle, per kolkhoz, green triangle. What have been the results of variety contact? During their migrations, the Mennonites repeatedly came into contact with other varieties and languages such as Dutch, Frisian, Russian, Ukrainian, and Kazakh. The internal relationship between the Chortitza and Molochna varieties is also not a one-way road. According to most of the authors mentioned above, there seemed to exist an upward convergence which has replaced Chortitzer features by those of the Molochna variety. However, as former studies in the Altai and in the Rosenberg Mennonite region, like Neumann 1997, yielded, the direction of convergence sometimes might be more complex. Some features followed the Molochna pattern, some others the Chortitzer pattern, and some did not converge at all. In Rosenberg, like in Altai Plautdietsch, the Chortitzer rounded front vowel Ü has spread over all villages and replaced the Molochna long back vowel U, as in fru, fru, üt, ut, and so on. Maybe the speakers have adopted it due to the numerical superiority of Chortitzer settlements, or it may be also considered as an attitudinal group symbol with the highest degree of traditionality, as a counter movement against the strong assimilating pressure from the Russian outer world. This, of course, seems hardly compatible with the Szymonsky theory of primary and secondary dialect features. With regard to the Altai Plautdietsch varieties, Jehlich questioned Szymonsky's assumption that only primary features of a dominant variety gain common acceptance. Instead, he argued, quotation, that as a result of dialect mixing in the system of the predominant dialect A, in our case Molochna, not only some remains of the replaced dialect B, in our case Chortitzer, but also distinct primary features can be enclosed. What about language contact with Russian? Russian influence, on the other hand, is certainly today the most intensive force, at least since the 1960s. Mennonites have ever been in contact with the Russian language since they settled in the Black Sea region. The influence grew at the latest since Russian has been introduced in school. Before that, in the Mennonite colonies, contact with Russian and Ukrainian was rather limited, although they had farm laborers from the surrounding villages. After the Russian Revolution, this changed fundamentally. The Russian language gained ground, backed by the institutional and attitudinal dominance of Russian language and culture, which was finally accepted by the Mennonites. The discontinuity of the settlement, with repeated disruptive changes in the composition of the village population, promoted the spread of Russian as the second mother tongue of the Mennonites. The foundation of central villages since the 1970s was the last step in this direction and brought different High and Low German varieties into one village. Linguistic contact between speakers of these varieties was more and more done by means of the Russian language. At the beginning of the 1990s, I studied the impact of linguistic heterogeneity in the Altai village of Riedgaya Dubrava, in German Gnadenheim. In this village, Mennonites were the majority of 62%. The remaining third of the inhabitants was made up of Catholics, 20%, and Lutherans, 14%, who spoke different varieties as their home language beside Russian. The Mennonites Plautdietsch, the Catholics a West Upper German variety, the Lutherans a Rhine-Franconian Volga German variety. This village was compared to the linguistically rather homogeneous village of Pocisnova, where the inhabitants spoke the Rhine-Franconian Volga German variety almost exclusively beside Russian. Comparing the two villages with respect to semi-public domains, at the workplace, for instance, German turned out to be more frequently used in the homogeneous village of Pocisnova. Note the white column at the right, while Russian was more common in the heterogeneous village of Riedkaya Dubrava. Within this village, the three groups behaved differently. The Lutherans and Catholics spoke more Russian. The Mennonites, who were the autochthonous group in the village, used more German. Since Standard German was rare, Russian had become the language of intergroup communication.
Especially Mennonites tended to use German much more within the in-group than with members of other dialect-speaking groups. This is particularly true for children and young people, and was confirmed by a linguistic network study in an upper school class. Blue elements here are Mennonite pupils, green ones Lutherans, orange ones Catholics. Blue arrows show use of German varieties, red is Russian. Mennonites and Lutherans spoke their own German variety with each other. See the Mennonite clusters in the blue circles with only blue arrows indicating German variety use within. As soon as other Germans joined the conversation, speakers switched to Russian, red circles. Hence, among younger speakers, the German vernacular served as intra-group variety, hardly as intergroup variety. With a breakdown of the Soviet Union and exodus set in, which once again caught Mennonites first and foremost. In the German National Rayon, re-established in 1991, villages emptied out. This has changed the situation greatly. The immigration of the vast majority of the Mennonite community to Germany has dissolved the language island for the most part. Today, in the villages, only 10 to 15% of the inhabitants are locally born people. While the number of ethnic German inhabitants only slightly decreased from the year of foundation, 1991, to the census 2010, the proportion of ethnic Germans fell significantly from 84% to 27%. Some of the new inhabitants are Germans from Central Asian republics, but speaking other German varieties or mostly Russian. The exchange of the population destabilized the linguistic setting in the villages. Nowadays, the German Rayon is a predominantly Russian-speaking but showcase of economic prosperity. A disruptive language shift emerged among Russian Germans who stayed in Russia after the exodus. Today, the Russian language is dramatically expanding in public and in private domains. Younger generations are quickly shifting to Russian. Code mixing is more frequent than code switching, and the proportion of second language learners outweighs native speakers. Intermarriage is steadily increasing, and getting vocational education outside of the village is common. Today, being German is not a primary distinction anymore. I've been studying linguistic development of the Altai language islands in the flood since 1994. Special attention was paid to the case system, which has been the subject of research in Shumanovka, a central village 40 kilometers north of Slavgorod. The village, founded in 1911, had a Mennonite autochthonous population. The central village was built out of Mennonite villages and one village speaking the West Upper German variety Catholic. All of the disruptive events of the Russian Mennonite history mentioned above took place also in Schumanovka. As a result, today, the language island is in dissolution and the language is in obsolescence. The study found that case syncretism, which leads to a common case or a complete reduction of case endings, is most pronounced in noun inflection, while the inflection of personal pronouns retains an oblique case, often in the dative form. 50 years ago, Yiddish saw dative as the main oblique case form preferred by the speakers, particularly the younger ones, while accusative was somehow outdated and only used by the older people. This applied also to the definite article or determiner, where Yiddish, as well as Niebuhr and Siemens and others in the past, noted the dative form, dem, as the main oblique case form in masculine and neuter. Note the red areas in the tables. Our empirical data in a translation task with more than 6,000 potentially case-marked elements show this has changed. In general, dative case marking in noun inflection is rare with less than 30%, indicated by the red column. The definite article in Plautdietsch is no exception. The dative form makes up a little more than a third, shown here with a red column. Reduction of case endings, the next red column to the right, is preferred. Apparently, the case system is exceedingly reduced and in part collapsed. My study of case marking came to the conclusion that the case system in noun inflection is simplified and in personal pronoun inflection, case semantically restructured. As I have suggested, the acceleration of language change in the Russian-German language islands is not simply a consequence of language contact and imposition, but of a loss of normativity, that is, of norm awareness and norm loyalty. This, in turn, seems to be the result of blurring ethnic boundaries. Conclusions regarding the future. Until the great exodus of the 1990s, Mennonite Low German in the Altai was a well-preserved language island variety. Its community maintained its linguistic tradition the best of all German-speaking language islands in Russia, USSR. The distinct ethno-cultural and at times religious boundary marking, in the words of the inventor of ethnological constructivism, Frederick Barth, 1969, constituted a real group in the sense of Rogers Brubaker. The Mennonite people en route made its way from the Netherlands to West Prussia, to the Black Sea, and to Siberia, and later to Canada, Latin America, and Germany. Until the recent migrations, these movements have been organized and controlled by the community leaders. Even though their deportations, resettlements, and eventual emigration were forced, it is no coincidence that the Mennonite resettlers were the first and best organized to emigrate. But the exodus of the autochthonous population destabilized the remaining settlements to a high degree. This brings to a close a development that had already begun. As an irony of history, the most dramatic decline in the German mother tongue declaration in the Soviet surveys did not occur in times of persecution and deportation, but since partial liberalization. The linguistic development of Plautdietsch is characterized by different influential sources on the basis of East Low German varieties, Low Prussian with Flemish and Frisian traces. The long isolation in the Slavic-speaking environment enlarged the distance to its sources of origin. Niebuhr suggested Plautdietsch to be, quote, considered an exocentric, ruthless language variety in the process of developing from a Low German dialect into a separate West Germanic language, unquote. The Chortitzer and Molochna varieties have been in touch all the time, where migrations permanently rearranged the demographic composition of the language islands. Dialect leveling occurred, was interrupted and reoccurred, but has never come to an end. Dialect leveling was not a one-way road. While most Molochna features predominate, some Chortitzer specifics are widespread. Parallel to this process, Russian influence grew. Before the 1870s, Russian was used mainly in external contact with Russian authorities. Since the turn of the 20th century, diglossia became internal and the Russian language entered into the administration, economy, and education of the colonies. Mennonites, however, had early incorporated the Russian language into school. This was no risk in terms of ethnic belonging, neither of linguistic affiliation, since they had a full variational system at their disposal, comprising Plautdietsch as the everyday language and Standard German as the language of service, of culture, and of education. While the persecutions, all public domains were conquered by the Russian language, and all German varieties got stigmatized in public. Non-public domains, however, remained the realm of Plautdietsch, not of Standard German. This changed in part with the liberalization of the 1970s, again supported by the demographic fusions in linguistically mixed central villages and kolkhozes. The intergenerational transmission of Plautdietsch thus was interrupted. As a result, second language learners gain ground. Russian captures even the non-public language domains. Changes in Plautdietsch morphology described above are not primarily Russian interferences, but contact-induced, but accelerated internal changes observable in other German varieties too. Most of the Plautdietsch speakers, however, are no more on Russian ground. They have left for Germany, Canada, Latin America, and elsewhere. Hence, Plautdietsch is not an endangered language, nor is the speakers community an endangered people. But the Plautdietsch-speaking language islands in Russia are islands in the flood. The islanders, however, have more or less happily made their way westwards from Russia with love and faith and at least Plautdietsch. I want to be a little bit critical with my own sources. And that is a point Eric made already. If you see that, maybe you have noticed that I used Karl Stump and Georg Leibrand. And these sources are really touchy. Why? The first one, Karl Stump, had the Sonderkommando Stump, and he was organizing the Deutsche Volksliste in the Black Sea region. Deutsche Volksliste is the people's list, categorizing the people into 4 categories: the true Germans, the maybe Germans, the true Slavic or bad people, and the maybe Slavic people, and the true Slavic people. Which you couldn't use for anything, including the Jews and all the other Untermenschen, right? And that meant that all his statistics are founded a little bit on that work. And we use it, of course, because it's really amazing in this richness of informations and details, of course, but we should have in mind this is a touchy thing. And interestingly, this guy has been classified in the year 1948 as a Mitläufer, a follower, by a commission. And he said that was purely scientific work. I've never been engaged in any political thing, but even among the Mennonites, there were three sources of influence of the Nazis. The first one has been the Volksdeutsche Mittelstelle. The second one has been the SS, Waffen-SS, Einsatzgruppe 6 and 7. And they committed massacres, the so-called Zaporizhia massacre, with 22 volunteers of Mennonites, badly. And the third one was the Sonderkommando Stump. And he did that. And the Georg Leibbrandt told us already, this is the protocol of the Wannsee Conference. And you see in the first position, Dr. Georg Leibbrandt, he was involved in the organizing of the extinction of the Jewish population. But the statistics, sadly, statistics of the German Nazis are a source until today. So I wanted to tell you that what my basis is, not the Nazis, but the statistics.